those of you who don't know, I'm Bill Mulligan. I'm president of the Jackson Purchase Historical Society. I'm especially happy, though, to be here. I mean, I didn't have to be persuaded to substitute. I first got involved with Columbus-Belmont State Park back in 1993 when I first came to Murray and was involved in a survey of Jackson Purchase Civil War sites. And I've come over the years, and for 30 years, I've continued off and on to do research on Columbus, both during the Civil War and in the years after, during what in the rest of the country is called Reconstruction, but which in Kentucky is called something else, readjustment, in the classic Merlin Coulter book. And I've come to see Columbus as one of the most important sites in the Civil War for a number of reasons. It may be small in population, but when one looks at key events in the war as it unfolded, one consistently finds Columbus at the center. Some of this I began to develop in a series of articles I've published in the Journal of the Jackson Purchase Historical Society, which is freely available through Digital Commons of Murray State University, and you can access it through your local public library. This is a good time to acknowledge a grant I received from the Kentucky African American Heritage Commission that allowed me to spend 10 days in the National Archives doing research primarily on Columbus. This led to 2 interpretive panels here in the park and for an article that I published. My entire understanding of the scale of operations surrounding Columbus changed. So much more was going on than appears in the official record, which I'll refer to as the OR. In the original documents, I quickly noticed a small rubber stamp in the left margin indicating that that document had been included in the OR. The others surrounding it had been left out. But quite often, the one document was a telegram from Columbus announcing an alert that Nathan Bedford Forrest was in the area. Fair enough. In the immortal words of Ed Bears, when he was chief historian of the Park Service, Bedford Forrest could wreck a railroad. You wanted to know if he was running loose in your area. But it turns out that there was not one telegram, but there were dozens going out to small locations all across the Jackson Purchase where a company of heavy artillery, a company of infantry was guarding a railroad bridge, guarding a strategic point to alert them. One telegram, I think, tells us one story. 12 telegrams being widely dispersed through the region speaks to the centrality of Columbus in the defense of the Jackson Purchase and maintaining military activities. It also shows Columbus as the center. As an aside, and this was always cute, the source of information is always either a loyal citizen or an intelligent slave. I'm sure there were intelligent citizens, but they're always designated a loyal citizen or an intelligent slave. And it's almost formulaic. One last point about Grant's telegram books. If there's any doubt that Columbus was central to the Vicksburg campaign, and that's one of the arguments I will make, and have made, is this is where the Vicksburg campaign drew its strength. All of the troops came through Columbus, all of the materiel came through Columbus. Everything Grant needed for Vicksburg came through here. Any failure to move things through caused issues. There are multiple series of telegrams which begin very simply. This is Captain Jones. The Major General commanding orders me to ask you, where is the 125th Wisconsin? The reply is always, I need them here. Forrest is active in the area. That is followed shortly, and sometimes very shortly, by another telegram. This is Colonel Smith. The Major General commanding orders me to tell you to send the 125th Wisconsin at once. The reply is much the same. Finally, there's a third and final telegram. This is the Major General commanding. You will send the 125th Wisconsin today. And then one notices a week or two later, there's a new commander at Columbus. One guy he sent to central Nebraska. Another one was sent to a swamp in Florida. This was not a good career move to hold up troops for Grant's Vicksburg campaign. They almost literally disappear. The Confederate months at Columbus have been well studied and well documented. And most histories of Columbus during the Civil War rightly begin with Leonidas Polk's occupation of Columbus in early September of 1861. This is the logical beginning and a momentous decision with major consequences. First and foremost, if you are going to defend the Mississippi River from attack from the north, this is the place. Given the military thinking of the day, which Polk would have learned at West Point from Dennis Hart Mahan, one occupies key strategic points to defend territory. And the South's initial war plan was to fight a defensive war, which is not surprising when you consider that all of their top military leaders, including Jefferson Davis, have been students of Mahan's at West Point. And he was the principal architect of U.S. Army military thinking and a major factor in how the United States Army plans to conduct warfare from the late 1820s until his death in 1872. He actually, this is an aside, he actually resigned his commission from the Army. He was a West Point graduate. He had studied with Sylvanus Thayer. He resigned his commission when they told him he had to leave the faculty at West Point and go on active duty somewhere else. And so he resigned his commission so he could stay at West Point and teach and do right about military tactics and strategy. When the Board of Governors of West Point told him in 1871, "You are too old, you have to retire," he went home and shot himself in the head. And he had a profound influence on American military thinking up through the Civil War. His prize student was Henry W. Halleck, who factors prominently in the history of the Civil War in our area. Now, this had not happened earlier. I mean, everyone knew Columbus didn't suddenly have some kind of earth movement that it suddenly had a bluff. It had been there all the time as the prime place to defend from a northern attack. But it was in Kentucky. And Kentucky was in a bit of a political stalemate. The governor, Beriah McGuffin, was favorable to secession, although he famously wrote a long letter to the other slave state governors suggesting they wait a while to see what Lincoln was actually going to do and not react to his rhetoric. The legislature, however, had what we would now call a veto-proof majority who had run on pro-union platforms. And so the question in Kentucky became a political standoff. The legislature was not interested in secession. MacGuffin was lukewarm at best. So Kentucky remains what many people see as neutral. But it's more that they're paralyzed. They can't decide politically. So you don't want to tip the balance. So both sides fairly scrupulously stayed out of Kentucky. Polk and Johnston are in Union City. Grant is in Cairo. Grant occasionally pushes the envelope with naval patrols along the rivers that venture into Kentucky waters. There are a few incidents in Ballard County where Union troops had been sent to do some reconnoitering. But basically, both sides had agreed to wait. So Polk's decision unlocks that logjam or unlocks that dam, and events rapidly take off. He takes Hickman and Columbus, and then he does what Mahan's manuals had taught him to do. He stopped, consolidated his supply lines, consolidated his force, and began to prepare for the next step. That's what he had been taught to do at West Point, even though he only served one day of active duty in the military. As most people who study the Civil War know, Polk resigned after receiving his commission and eventually became the Episcopal Bishop of Louisiana. Meanwhile, Grant hears of this from friendly sources in the purchase, and Grant is a clever devil. I mean, whatever else you want to say about U.S. Grant, the man was clever. He sends a telegram to the leadership of the state legislature. Do you want me to put troops into Kentucky to protect you from this invasion? And the legislature says, yes, please do. MacGuffin would have said, that's okay, no. He knew not to ask MacGuffin. He asked people he knew would give him the answer he wanted. So Grant moves in and occupies Paducah and Smithland, which also fit Mahan's definition of key strategic points being the confluence of major rivers. So far everyone is playing by the book. And one of the interesting things about the U.S. Civil War is that both armies followed essentially the same set of manuals, at least at the beginning. And most of the officers who were West Point graduates had the same training and background. And so there are these classic exchanges, Grant and Buckner at Surrender House at Dover after Fort Donelson. Buckner says, if I had been in charge from the beginning, I would have defended the fort differently. And Grant's reply was, if you had been in charge, I would have attacked differently. I know. We know each other. By the way, that's one of the things that gets Grant into trouble at Shiloh. He never expected Albert Sidney Johnson would leave Corinth. Never occurred to him that Sidney Johnson would do something that risky. But he did. Polk fortified Columbus, and he and those of his officers who had gone to West Point had been trained. The fort is well sited, high on a bluff with an excellent view and range of fire. Swampy land to its north, making it very hard to invest by land. No real reason to fear attack from the south. And to the east is the rest of a Confederate defense line that is rapidly in the process of being established. Forts Henry, Donelson, Bowling Green, and with Camp Beauregard closing the gap between Columbus and Fort Henry. So his eastern flank is covered, northern flank is protected naturally, the river, the south is friendly territory. He doesn't have to worry about his supply lines. The supply lines are coming from the south. They're very safe and secure. So he's followed the book and has created a formidable obstacle, as Grant will learn. And I'm seeing my friend and colleague Barry Craig there. Reminds me of a piece Barry wrote about the Gibraltar of the West. And this was the second most heavily fortified place in North America for a time. The only place that was more heavily fortified was Harper's Ferry, the federal arsenal there. There's actually more artillery and more protection here than surrounding Washington. Grant does the same thing at Paducah and Smithland, having forts built under the designation of C.F. Smith, who interestingly had been one of Grant's instructors at West Point and was one of the U.S. Army's experts on fortification design and construction. And he builds Fort Anderson in Paducah and two forts in Smithland, one of which was called Fort Smith, the other of which no one seems to know what the name was. I've never been able to find the name of the second fort. Fort Anderson, of course, sadly, is gone. And the fort in Smithland is completely overgrown. But if you're not afraid of snakes, you can go up and explore it. Grant also had secure supply lines. His supply lines are coming from the north. They're coming down the Ohio River from Evansville, Cincinnati, through Cairo. So both sides have positioned themselves according to what they had been trained to do at West Point. Grant begins to test Columbus's defenses. While he's in Cairo training his troops and working with Naval Flag Officer Andrew Foote on designing a river-specific gunboat, which will figure in the story later, he sends more traditional gunboats down the river to test Columbus's defenses. And he determines quickly that this is not an attack he cares to make. The range of the guns is extensive. I know there's a lot of people here who are familiar with the Civil War, and so this might seem like something everyone knows, but not everyone does know it. For reasons I've never been able to understand, because my trigonometry is not very good, Civil War artillery fires better downhill than uphill. They're much more accurate firing down than they are firing up. To me, this makes no logical sense, but it's apparently true, and it has to do with the math, which means I'll never understand. So Grant's not gonna, his boats in the river, no matter how many guns, how many cannons he puts on them, how many guns he puts on them, he's no match for what Columbus has. 141 pieces of artillery is the best estimate. Some very, very large pieces with range of miles, and they can see for miles. And most of these ships are easy to spot because they belch smoke. So, and this is an interesting insight into Grant. One of the reasons he doesn't decide to attack Columbus is because he's afraid of the number of casualties that will incur. At the beginning of the war, Grant is casualty averse. He actually criticized Winfield Scott during the Mexican War when he was a captain or lieutenant for taking too many casualties and fighting too many battles on the campaign that led to the capture of Mexico City. Grant argued Scott could have been much more economical. This is not the Grant we remember from the end of the war, when he has gotten over it. But he apparently physically became ill at the sight of blood. So he's not looking for a massive all-out assault. And the other thing that this reminds me of, at least, is the Army is still coming together. At the end of the war, there were roughly 1 million men in the U.S. Army on active duty. That's not the case in late 1861 and early 1862. You still have recruitment going on. You still have people showing up in Cairo who have maybe fired their rifle once or twice, can barely march in step. They're not ready to be thrown against dug-in fortifications with artillery. And Grant, to his credit, recognizes that. But basically, there's a stalemate that continues. Instead of between Cairo and Union City, it's between Paducah and Smithland and Columbus and Hickman and across the line. The next event that stirs things up begins in late January, February of 1862, when Lloyd Tillman takes command of Fort Henry and quickly realizes that Fort Henry is indefensible. It is in the floodplain. It is at river level. The river floods. The fort, remember, is in the floodplain. There's his wonderful dispatch in the official record that he sends to his superior that very diplomatically asks, who is the moron who put this fort in the floodplain? And he immediately, now that Kentucky's neutrality has been broken, begins building a new fort on the opposite side of the river that will be known as Fort Hyman after the engineer in charge, who's a German, of German ancestry. Grant gets word of this, and I like to think visions of Columbus dance through his head as he tries to sleep. Oh my God, another fort 150 feet above the river with artillery. And my mission, which I have accepted, is to capture these rivers. And Fort Donelson, which is not quite as high as Columbus or Hyman, but is 100 or so feet above the river for the river batteries, Grant suddenly sees his life becoming very difficult. If the three major rivers he's supposed to capture each have Columbus-style fortifications, his task is going to be nigh well impossible, at least in the short run. So he immediately begins asking for permission to attack Fort Henry. And this is another instance where the telegram book comes into play and is crucial. You won't find this in the official record. On one day, he sends Halleck 8 telegrams. You must give me permission to attack. And he lays out, but 8 telegrams in one day. That's a sense of urgency. Halleck reluctantly gives him permission. Halleck does not have a lot of confidence in Grant. And that's another story. I mean, I don't know if it's a quick aside. Grant's military career started with great promise and ended in disappointment. He was cited twice for bravery in the Mexican War, cited in dispatch for conspicuous bravery twice. In the modern Army, that probably would have been silver stars or bronze stars with a V for valor. Back then, it was just mentioned in the dispatch. He does fine. When he goes to Washington State, he's promoted to captain. There's only 15 captains in the entire United States Army. Grant is promoted to captain. He has to be doing pretty well. Then he gets to California, and he becomes depressed. He misses his wife and family. Grant did not drink. He was not a drinker. That's a myth that's created after the war, largely. But he is depressed because he's not with his wife. He is seen by his fellow officers as unmanly. What kind of an officer can't function because he's lonely? and he's allowed to resign. And if you think he was a drunk, the same day literally the same day that Grant resigned, one of his West Point classmates was court-martialed and dismissed from the military for excessive drunkenness. So if Grant was a drunk, why did he get let off when his classmate, they could have just as easily court-martialed them both? Now, I'm not going to recount the details of the battles of Fort Henry and Fort Donelson. The outcome for victory for the Union at both set in motion a chain of events, however, that had profound consequences for Columbus. The Confederate defense line crumbles quickly across its entire length. More important for Columbus, its entire eastern defense was destroyed. Fort Henry, Fort Donelson are captured, occupied by the Union Army, and Camp Beauregard, its closest defender, is decimated, not even decimated, is almost obliterated by a measles and meningitis epidemic that kills almost the entire garrison. They're almost all from Mississippi. And this epidemic sweeps through Camp Beauregard. It was late January into early February. Suddenly there's no defense on the east. And Grant has a growing army. Volunteers are pouring down the rivers from Cairo. He now has a cadre of battle-experienced troops who fought at, no, they didn't really fight at Fort Henry. Fort Henry is really, as everyone knows, Fort Henry is a naval victory. And that also got Grant in trouble with Halleck, but you can leave that for the Q&A. But he now at Donelson has troops that have, as the Civil War soldiers said, they've seen the elephant. They have been in combat. And they are ready. Polk now comes to see his position as very vulnerable. I mean, he could theoretically have begun feverishly erecting defenses, digging trenches and building up earthworks to the east. But there's also now the danger of his supply lines being, at least his land supply lines being compromised, as Grant now has freedom to move in from the east. So he makes a decision to abandon Columbus and relocate to Union City and Corinth with Albert Sidney Johnston. And so the war moves on. The Confederates regroup to fight another day, and that day will come soon in early April at Shiloh. Columbus, however, is not left fallow. Columbus is occupied by federal forces and who move in without a hostile shot being fired and remain for the duration of the war and some time after. And Columbus remains a key strategic point. But an important element is that it shifts from being a defensive position to being an offensive and a logistical position. Its purpose is not to defend the Mississippi River anymore. Its purpose is to facilitate the movement of men and materiel to the south, down the river, and more importantly, as Grant begins to discover, with the railroad. Columbus is the northern terminus of the Mobile and Ohio Railroad. And at least as far as he can go at least as far as Union City with the railroad at that time. But if he's going to, the positioning is now reversed. This is going to be an offensive position. Now, railroads and steamboats, interestingly, are not mentioned in American military doctrine until after the Civil War. They had been invented long before the Civil War, but Dennis Hart Mahan actually in one of his writings said nothing new has occurred in the science of warfare since Napoleon. He was a big fan of Napoleon. And, well, a few things had happened, Dennis. He doesn't account for the railroad or the steamboat. You can move troops much, much more quickly. And you can move supplies much, much more quickly. Consolidating your supply lines is not as time consuming. You can move quickly. You don't have to regroup between each objective. And Grant had gotten in trouble for violating that after the surrender of Fort Donelson. When he captured Fort Henry and Fort Donelson, 13,000 Confederate troops, all of their weapons and artillery. Halleck suspended him from command for not having had permission to attack. He was supposed to stop at Fort Henry and regroup and secure his supply lines and wait for permission to move ahead. Grant intuitively figured the longer he waited, the more finished Fort Donelson would be. In fact, he got there the day after they had put the last gun in place in the river battery. This, I think, is a crucial moment when Grant discovers the importance of speed and aggressiveness in modern warfare, and begins now to depart from the doctrines that he had been taught at West Point and to redefine the nature of modern warfare. And this is when Halleck's nickname was Old Brains, and it was meant as a compliment. He was wise beyond his years. Old Brains. It now comes to be something of a veiled insult. Yeah, old brains, as in things have passed him by. He's not up to speed. A huge Union complex develops here. Troops and supplies pass through on their way further south. The volume is especially high during the Vicksburg campaign. In addition to some fortifications for defense, Columbus becomes a district headquarters. Buildings are constructed for commissary transportation and other functions to support the campaign. Numerous buildings, dozens, were constructed. I'm still trying to get a good map so I can count them. These activities required a significant garrison force, which meant that you had not just troops passing through, but troops who were there for a long haul, who had to be fed and housed, and medical care had to be provided. Columbus becomes a full-scale military base, which is a relatively new concept. One of the sources that I've come across are the letters of a Union soldier who enlisted in the Union Army at the age of 16, which was too young. He lied about his age. And from Buffalo County, Wisconsin. And his father was an outspoken abolitionist, and young Chauncey enlisted to save the Union and free the slaves. In fact, on his tombstone in Buffalo County, he has carved, friend of the colored races, the Indian and the African, defender of the Union. He wrote a series of letters home, and I do a separate program on Chauncey, which I'll do in October. I guess it is at the County Public Library. But about 5 years ago, the New York Times listed it as one of the best books written by a homesick person. And I think they were referring to Chauncey, not to me. But February of 1863. This is a letter to his mother. The site of our camp here in Columbus, Kentucky is fine. You can see for miles up and down the river. We are on a hot bluff 200 feet higher than the town. Excuse me. The water is not good though, and we drink cold coffee to quench thirst. No enemy can approach us by water on the land side. We throw out pickets every day and a half-moon circle touching the river above and the town below. We cannot be taken by surprise from the land. We have a lot of heavy cannon behind strong breastworks. We are overlooking the river so that no hostile fleet could reach us. On the land side, there seems little danger of attack. Half the people in this part of Kentucky are Union, and we would have plenty of warning of any rebel advance. I think his estimate of Union support is a little high. I have been on picket duty in the woods some 2 miles from town twice since coming here. My beat was supposed to keep moving constantly back and forth for 2 hours at a stretch. And he ends the letter, but those delightful days are no more, referring to life in Buffalo County. I am here in faraway Kentucky. Confound it, there goes the drum. It means put on your belts and get out for drill. A little insight into camp life, being called to get to work. This is a few days later. We drill every day, do police work, cleaning around the camp, and take a stroll now and then back in the country as far as the pickets will let us. We are really in the sunny South. The slaves, contrabands, we call them, are flocking into Columbus by the hundred. General Thomas of the regular army here is enlisting them for war. All the old buildings on the edge of town are more than full. You never meet anyone referring to an enslaved person, but he jerks his hat off and bows and shows his whitest teeth. I never saw a bunch of them together, but I could pick out an Uncle Tom, a Quimbo, a Sambo, a Chloe, and Eliza, or any other character in Uncle Tom's Cabin. And that, of course, relates to one of the debated incidents in the history of the Civil War when Lincoln met Harriet Beecher Stowe and supposedly said, "It's a pleasure to meet the little lady whose book started this whole thing." Some historians say that's not true. Well, here's young Chauncey Cook, staunch young abolitionist from the wilds of Wisconsin. Buffalo, Wisconsin is 900 miles upriver from Columbus. It's on the river, 900 miles upstream. It turns out he had never seen a black person. Everything he and his father, who at one point said in a public meeting, "I am prepared to sacrifice the life of one of my sons, as Abraham was prepared to sacrifice Isaac if it would rid this nation of the scourge of slavery." And in an essay Chauncey wrote for County History, he simply commented, "I knew who Dad was talking about." So Uncle Tom's Cabin was the frame of reference that his father had, that he had. And he was prepared literally to sacrifice his own life because he enlisted in the Army at 16 and was found out and chose to bluff his way through the inspection. He chose to go off to fight at 16. So how am I doing on time? I tend to go long. I don't see a clock.
You're a quarter after. 11:50.
Oh, I should. So anyway, if you want, I brought some copies of the book if you're interested. There's a lot on the experience of African Americans, but I want to cut ahead because some other things I think that are also a little less known, and I'm sorry, I'm used to professoring. After the war ended, the military base at Columbus was decommissioned. Columbus served as a district office for the Freedmen's Bureau, and the Bureau provided legal advice and assistance to former slaves, allowing them to record their marriages and provided assistance in the construction of schools and churches by the freedmen. It also helped eligible veterans apply for pensions and other government assistance. The records show that there was no small amount of violence in Hickman County between the freedmen and the citizens. The Bureau did not have many resources to maintain order, and its existence in Kentucky was legally questionable because Kentucky had never left the Union. And this is a part of the project I'm still working on, but we have extensive records. All the records are in Washington, Records Group 105 in the National Archives, and I brought home lots and lots of photocopies. And if you've ever worked in the National Archives, but they have a one-cart rule. Each person can only have one cart full of documents. I was there with a woman I was dating at the time, and she was an archivist, and we each had a cart, and we each filled it with documents, and they have self-service copying, and so we were just tag-teaming the copy machine. And we got a lot done. But that's something I'm going to write up fairly soon. The last thing I want to do is talk about where did all of this stuff go? There were 141 cannons. There were weapons. There was government property everywhere. There were buildings. Well, in the spring of 1865, Alfred Avery Lampkin arrived in Columbus. Lampkin was a civilian employee of the Quartermaster Corps. He had enlisted in the Army and served as a private until promoted to lieutenant, and then resigned his commission and became a civilian employee for the Quartermaster Corps. He kept his diary during his time in Columbus, and eventually it found its way to, of all places, the Missouri University of Science and Technology in Rolla, where it hid in plain sight until I tracked it down through the wonders of WorldCat, which is a library database. This was like finding, the lost, the Holy Grail. I mean, this is it, and it's been there, and it was in, and no one, as far as I can tell, had ever looked at it. Who would look in Rolla, Missouri? And WorldCat is relatively new. Well, Lampkin, first order of business, he consigned all of the artillery and weaponry to be shipped down the river to New Orleans, where it would be dispersed to federal armories and arsenals across the country. He did an inventory, packed it up, arranged the shipping, sent it all out. The various buildings were surveyed. He measured them, wrote descriptions of them, and then held an auction and auctioned off the lumber and the nails. Nails are precious in this time. You reuse the nails. And he would have an auction, and he would sell the various buildings, and the people would come with their wagons and disassemble it and take it home. And he cleared out all of the buildings that had not been here before the war. I was going to say more about him, but this is a sign, I guess, of old age. I couldn't find my file on him. Since I retired from the university, all of my files have become mixed in and are complicated. I'm sure it'll turn up tomorrow. But I remember it well because it was just so detailed. And about once a week, there's an entry, went riding in the country with some of the town's young ladies. So clearly this was not a hardship post for Lampkin. He was in fact, in Cook's letters, there's mentions to a lot of the soldiers walking and talking with the young ladies from Columbus. It's really fascinating because he's this wide-eyed kid looking at this very different part of the world. Well, I've gone a little longer than I intended, so I think I'm going to stop now. Well, thank you all very much. I appreciate you hanging in there.